Your grandparents' gardens were a picture of abundance, baskets of vegetables, rows of beans, and pantries stocked for the winter. That's because they knew how to get the most from their land. They worked with the things they already had and didn't waste money on fancy products. Instead, they used clever planting techniques, homemade soil boosters, and resourceful tricks to stretch their harvests. Here are 50 ways your grandma grew more food from less work. The Chicken Cleanup Crew. Back in the day, chickens were more than egg layers. Your grandparents kept them working in the garden with movable pens built from wood and wire. These pens, called chicken tractors, were set over a patch of ground and left for days. The birds scratched, ate weed seeds, and gobbled up insects hidden in the soil. As they worked, they manured the earth, leaving it richer and ready for planting. After a week, the pen was moved and another patch was cleared and fertilized without a hoe lifted. At season's end, chickens were turned loose in empty beds to strip out old plants and devour lingering pests. Their constant scratching mixed everything back into the soil. Nothing was wasted, and the birds were well fed while the garden was quietly prepared for the next crop. The Dew Collection Trick. When mornings left the grass wet, old gardeners knew their plants were drinking too. Dew clung to broad leaves and fuzzy stems, and in some gardens it supplied a quarter of the water the crops needed in dry spells. Certain plants like borage and lamb's ear were chosen because they gathered more dew than others. They were planted among lettuces and beans to share the extra dampness as it dripped into the soil. Garden beds in hollows or beside stone walls held more moisture, since cool surfaces collected droplets each night. People even walked the garden at sunrise, placing hands under leaves to feel the gift before the sun burned it away. This was irrigation without wells or buckets, a quiet method that made crops endure when rain held back. Charcoal and biochar soil amendment. Charcoal was once more than fuel for the stove. Old gardeners crushed it fine and spread it into their fields to lock in fertility. Mixed with compost and manure, the black particles held moisture like tiny sponges and trapped nutrients that would otherwise wash away in the rain. Worms worked it deeper, carrying the fragments through the soil where roots found them season after season. Unlike plant matter that rotted quickly, charcoal lasted for decades, building a soil that stayed dark, rich, and loose. In some places, families shoveled out ash and half-burnt wood from cooking fires, spreading it across their gardens each spring. Over time, these additions created ground that outproduced neighboring plots, needing less manure and giving larger harvests. Seeds sprouted more evenly, crops endured longer in droughts, and soil never hardened into lifeless clay. Grafting for tree survival. Rather than planting new trees every time an old one weakened, gardeners joined branches from desired varieties onto strong rootstocks. A cut was made, a scion fitted, and the wound bound with cloth or wax until the pieces grew together. This practice allowed fragile fruits like apples and pears to thrive on hardy native bases that resisted disease and frost. Families preserved favorite flavors this way, passing them down through grafted limbs rather than relying on seed, which often grew wild and unpredictable. Orchards became collections of carefully matched unions, each tree carrying the strength of one stock and the sweetness of another. The work required skillful hands, but paid back with steady crops year after year. Root division. Rather than buy new plants, old gardeners divided what they had. Clumps of rhubarb, horseradish, or asparagus were dug in early spring, split with a spade, and replanted into fresh soil. This gave twice the crop without spending a penny. Herbs like mint, chives, and thyme spread easily and were lifted, cut, and shared with neighbors. Even flowering perennials like daylilies and peonies were renewed this way, their vigor restored by the trimming. Dividing plants was not wasteful, it was the expected way to maintain a thriving garden. Beds stayed productive, and households gained new plantings for free. Hügelkultur Beds. Logs, branches, and brush that seemed like waste became the base of raised beds. Old gardeners stacked this woody core, piled grass clippings and manure over it, then topped it with soil. Over time, the buried wood decayed slowly, releasing nutrients back into the bed. The rotting logs held moisture like sponges, keeping plants alive in dry spells. Heat from decomposition warmed roots early in the season, extending the growing time. Beds stood high, easy to work without bending as far, and lasted for years before settling. By using what the land offered, fallen trees, hedge trimmings, straw, gardeners built long-lasting mounds that produced abundant harvests with less watering and less feeding. The weather signs. Before newspapers printed forecasts and long before radios gave warnings, gardeners leaned on nature's own signals. Your grandparents would look at woolly caterpillars, noting how wide or narrow the brown band was to judge how fierce the winter might turn. They watched the moon as carefully as the sunrise, knowing that root crops thrived when planted on the waning side and leafy crops fared better as the moon waxed. They would step outside in spring and study oak leaves, waiting until they were the size of a squirrel's ear before setting seed in the ground. Maple trees running with sap and dandelions bursting in fields were their thermometer. No need for gadgets when years of watching taught them what signs to trust. These little rules lived in family almanacs, scribbled by hand, repeated until they were second nature. A red sky at dusk, frogs croaking in chorus, or the heavy scent of earth after a warm rain, each carried a message. It wasn't guesswork, but a rhythm of observation passed down through time. The rabbit manure secret. When neighbors fretted about expensive fertilizers, some households kept a small hutch out back where rabbits chewed hay and left their quiet gift. Unlike cow or chicken droppings, rabbit pellets were gentle enough to use fresh, scattered right over the beds without waiting months for compost. Each tiny pellet was a ready-made fertilizer, rich in nutrients but mild on tender roots. They were gathered with ease, with trays slipped beneath the hutch or swept up with straw. A handful tossed around tomato plants, another sprinkled near lettuces, and suddenly the soil carried new life. The plants grew lush, the leaves stayed green, and pests seemed less of a bother. Folks could spend good money on powders and sacks, but nothing matched the steady, natural power of rabbit manure. The rabbits gave twice, meat or fur in lean times, and a garden that seemed to know it was being cared for. Even a single pair of rabbits could feed a whole family's vegetables with their pellets alone. Seaweed Fertilizer. Coastal farmers walked the tide line after storms, gathering piles of kelp and seaweed tossed ashore. These were dragged to fields and laid thick between rows, where they held moisture and broke down into a rich mulch. Seaweed carried minerals from the ocean, potassium, iodine, magnesium, that inland soils lacked. It decomposed quickly, feeding crops within weeks and leaving the ground dark and loose. In sandy soil, it bound grains together, preventing washout. In heavy soil, it lightened the texture, making plowing easier. Some boiled it into liquid teas poured at the base of fruit trees, while others chopped it into pieces and buried it under seed potatoes. Nothing from the sea went to waste, for what washed in with the tide went back to the earth to grow another harvest. Quilt Gardening. Back when every patch of soil mattered, gardens weren't laid out for show, but for practicality. Your grandparents arranged their plots like quilts, squares and rectangles, stitched together with narrow footpaths. It looked patchy, almost homely, but it was clever. This design let them reach every plant without compacting the soil underfoot. Soil that stayed light and loose grew better crops, while the paths, layered with straw or sawdust, kept weeds down and funneled water where it was needed most. Each square could be tended like its own little garden, one patch of beans, another of onions, another for lettuce picked fresh each morning. Nothing wasted, nothing forgotten. Because the beds were small and orderly, a gardener could weed or water without trudging across the whole yard. A quilt garden was easy on the back, light on the feet, and heavy with produce. Folks said it saved nearly half the walking of straight row fields. It was also easier to rotate crops square by square, keeping soil healthier and bugs confused. Year-round planting calendar. Old gardens didn't sit idle. To old folks, the land worked 12 months a year. Winter was for planting, when notes were drawn on scrap paper, marking dates and tallying rows for beans, cabbages, and potatoes. In spring, planting was staggered, never putting all the lettuce down at once, but sowing in little batches every couple of weeks, so the table was never without fresh leaves. Once one crop was pulled, another went into the same soil. Peas gave way to beans, onions to turnips, tomatoes to autumn greens. Every bed had more than one job to do. Families often measured how much to plant by old formulas. So many tomato plants per person, so many rows of potatoes to fill the cellar. Nothing wasted space, and nothing sat bare if it could grow something. Even a small yard could feed mouths through 3 seasons if planned carefully. The soil was kept busy, but never exhausted, for rotation and care made it rich. Piss pots, urine fertilizer. It sounds bizarre at first, but urine was once gathered as carefully as rainwater. Families kept clay pots or barrels to collect it, sometimes adding straw or ash to balance the strong scent. When diluted with water, it was poured around the roots of crops as a ready-made nitrogen fertilizer. Cabbages grew greener, grains stood taller, and fruit trees pushed stronger growth after these feedings. Nothing from the body was wasted, for even what others threw away was seen as part of the cycle of soil and food. The liquid soaked quickly into the ground, leaving no trace but healthier plants. In poor years, when manure was scarce, this method kept gardens producing. It was not spoken of loudly, but it was common practice, known to work and repeated without question. Zone gardening. The smartest gardeners weren't just planters, they were walkers who counted their steps. Old gardeners arranged their yards in zones, each space chosen for how often it needed a visit. Closest to the kitchen door sat herbs and quick pickings, parsley, lettuce, onions. A step outside meant dinner was already seasoned. A little farther off were beans, peas, and carrots, crops needing care once or twice a week. At the far edge of the plot, potatoes, pumpkins, and winter squash sprawled, left mostly alone until harvest time. This simple arrangement saved miles of walking over a season, sparing tired feet and giving more time for real work. No minutes were wasted trekking across the yard for a handful of mint or a sprig of thyme. Paths led straight to the plants most often touched, and long rows of seldom-tended crops grew where they wouldn't demand daily presence. By grouping crops by care, your grandma cut labor in half without losing a single bite of food. Cover crops to feed soil. When autumn emptied the fields, most folks left their beds bare. Old gardeners knew that bare soil lost its strength to wind, rain, and frost. Instead, they sowed cover crops, rye, clover, or buckwheat, plants that grew quickly and fed the soil rather than the family. They held the ground together through winter, kept weeds from taking over, and pulled nutrients up from deep below. When spring neared, they were cut down and turned under, letting the green mass rot into rich earth. Neighbors who left their soil naked had to add more manure and compost to bring it back to life. But this ground woke up ready, already fed and eager. This was the secret. Let the plants do the work while the gardener rested. Even small beds and cottage yards benefited, sprouting cover crops after the harvest of beans or beets. By the time seedlings were ready again, the soil had been softened, enriched, and made full of life. Weeds that work for you. Your grandma didn't curse every weed that showed itself. Some were kept on purpose because they had deep roots that brought up minerals from the subsoil. Comfrey was a favorite, its broad leaves cut down and laid on the beds to rot into a strong natural mulch. Dandelions, far from being just a nuisance, were clipped and dropped to release calcium and potassium back into the soil. Yarrow, too, was valued for its hidden stores of nutrients. Instead of hauling in fertilizers, folks let these so-called weeds do the mining underground. When cut and left where they grew, they gave more to the soil than many crops planted for harvest. Their leaves became food for worms, their roots broke up heavy clay, and their presence kept the garden richer year after year. While some neighbors pulled them all out, wise hands trimmed and dropped them, letting nature return her own gifts. Catching rainwater in soil. Long before rain barrels stood beside houses, your grandparents shaped the land to hold water where it fell. Shallow ditches, called swales, were dug across slopes with small mounds on the lower side. When rain came, it collected instead of running away, soaking into the soil where crops waited. In wet years, this slowed flooding, keeping soil from washing out. In dry years, it left hidden reserves of moisture that roots could tap for weeks. Every path of water was studied, puddles noted, slopes observed, and from that knowledge, trenches and ridges were laid. These earthworks were simple, needing no tools beyond spades and patience, yet they made gardens stay green when others browned. Plants along the swales flourished with little help, fed by water stored deep in the ground. Strategic shade. Most advice said vegetables needed full sun, but your grandparents learned that too much heat drove greens to bolt and seeds to form too early. They planted tall crops like corn or sunflowers where they would cast shadows in the hottest hours of summer. Lettuce, spinach, and cabbage stayed crisp and tender longer under this shield. Trellised beans stretched across east to west lines, casting dappled shade beneath. In spring and autumn, when the sun's angle was lower, the shade disappeared, leaving the ground open for light again. This system extended harvests without extra water or effort. By shaping light and shadow as carefully as soil, they turned scorching afternoons into a time of steady growth. The bug barrier method. Instead of sprays, many old gardens used borders of strong-scented herbs to keep pests from crossing in. Rows of rosemary, thyme, or lavender were planted around vegetable beds, masking the smell of crops and confusing insects searching for food. Taller herbs in back, shorter ones in front, created a wall of fragrance that flying and crawling bugs disliked. At the same time, these plants lured pollinators with their blooms, so bees and butterflies visited while beetles and moths stayed away. Some families used marigolds or tansy as barriers when herbs were scarce. The simple ring around a plot often reduced infestations more than powders could. It cost nothing but a little space and repaid itself with healthier plants and fewer ruined leaves. Plant decoys to save harvest. Old gardeners sometimes planted sacrificial crops, known today as trap crops, to draw insects away from the food they wanted to keep. Nasturtiums were sown near beans and cabbages because aphids flocked to them first. Blue Hubbard squash was set on the edges of pumpkin and cucumber patches, luring beetles away from the main vines. Early potatoes were planted separately to draw the Colorado beetle before the main crop sprouted. These decoys took the damage while the chosen vegetables grew in peace. It was a simple game of misdirection, using insect preferences against them. By giving up a little, they saved a lot, and shelves were filled with food that might have been lost without these living shields. The weed scratcher. A long handle, a thin blade, and a light touch, this was the tool many old gardeners swore by. It wasn't a heavy hoe that tore through soil, but a weed scratcher, built to skim just below the surface. It cut young weeds off at the root with hardly a bend of the back. Many were homemade, crafted from an old rake handle and a flat strip of sharpened steel. Used at the right moment, when weeds had just sprouted, the tool cleared rows in minutes. The soil stayed loose, not churned, and fewer dormant seeds were stirred to life. For older gardeners, this tool meant years more in the field, since it spared the back and knees from constant stooping. Simple and cheap, yet it saved more work than most modern machines. The soil improver, wheel cultivator. Among the most useful tools in the shed was the wheel cultivator, sometimes called a push plow. A simple frame with a wooden handle and a single wheel in front, it carried interchangeable attachments: stirrup hose, seeders, and plow tips. Old folks pushed it down rows to loosen soil, slice weeds, and even plant seed at even depths. It required no animal, no fuel, only steady arms guiding it forward. Unlike heavy plows, it didn't compact the soil, and unlike hand tools, it worked quickly across long rows without stooping. Every pass saved hours of bending and pulling, leaving beds ready for growth. The cultivator was often built at home from scrap wood and iron, repaired year after year, and passed from one generation to the next. The garden fork, Broadfork. Before motorized tillers, a wide-tined fork was the tool for loosening ground. The Broadfork had 2 handles and long metal teeth that sank deep with body weight, then lifted the soil without turning it. Old gardeners used it to prepare new beds or refresh old ones without breaking the soil layers where worms and microbes thrived. Unlike spades that chopped and flipped, the Broadfork kept the structure intact, allowing roots to grow deep and water to move freely. It was slower than machines but left the earth healthier. A well-made fork could last decades, and many were handed down with worn handles polished by years of work. The fermentation method for seeds. Certain seeds, like tomatoes and cucumbers, were never saved straight from the fruit. Old gardeners fermented them first. Seeds were scooped into a jar with a little water and left for a few days to bubble and sour. This process broke down the slippery coating that prevented germination and killed many seed-borne diseases. Once the pulp floated away and the good seeds sank, they were rinsed, dried, and stored. Though it smelled unpleasant, the method guaranteed stronger crops the next year. Families who practiced it always had healthier, truer plants than those who skipped the step. It required only patience and a jar, yet it preserved entire varieties for generations. Seed storage solutions. Seed storage was treated with care, for the next harvest depended on it. Old gardeners dried their seeds thoroughly, then tucked them into paper envelopes, glass jars, or tins sealed with wax. A pinch of ash, charcoal, or even rice was added to absorb moisture. Cool pantries, root cellars, and attic drawers were chosen for safekeeping, away from sunlight and heat. Seeds were always labeled with crop, variety, and year, written in pencil so the words did not fade. Some families buried clay pots of seed beneath barn floors to keep them cool and dry through hot summers. These small rituals kept seed alive and strong, ensuring gardens never failed for lack of planting stock. Simple cutting propagation. A sharp knife, a jar of water, and patience were the only tools needed to multiply plants through cuttings. Old gardeners snipped shoots of currants, grapes, or gooseberries and set them in water or damp soil until roots appeared. Willow twigs were often soaked alongside, their natural rooting compounds encouraging other cuttings to take hold. Some kept small frames covered with glass panes to hold humidity until the new plants settled. By this method, orchards expanded, berry patches spread, and herb gardens filled without purchase. It was a quiet skill handed down like a recipe that stretched one plant into many and made the garden grow richer year by year. Crop rotation, medieval system. Fields were never planted the same way year after year. Old farmers divided their land into 2 or 3 plots, each treated differently. One held grains like wheat or rye, another legumes such as peas or beans, and a third might be left fallow. The following season, the crops rotated and the empty plot became active again. Each plant drew or gave back something different to the soil. Grains pulled out nitrogen, legumes restored it, and the resting field recovered naturally. This constant shifting also broke cycles of pests and disease, since insects depending on one crop found nothing familiar in the same place the next year. Yields improved by as much as a third, with no extra manure or fertilizer. The soil stayed lively, crops stayed healthy, and families stayed fed through the simple discipline of moving plantings in rhythm. The Moldboard Plow. In heavy northern soils, simple wooden plows could not cut deep enough. The Moldboard Plow solved that. Built with a vertical knife called a coulter, a horizontal blade, and a curved board, it sliced, lifted, and turned the soil in one motion. Weeds and old stubble were buried, feeding the ground as they rotted. The deeper cut allowed roots to reach moisture and air that had been locked beneath hard clods. Fewer oxen were needed to pull this improved tool, meaning less land was set aside to grow fodder. Communities often shared one, passing it from strip to strip until every family had broken their ground. It turned farming in clay-rich regions from misery into possibility, and for centuries it remained the backbone of field preparation. Weed management strategies. Weeds were controlled by timing and simple tools. Crops were planted close together so little sunlight reached the soil, smothering many weeds before they sprouted. Shallow hoes cut seedlings when they were no more than threads, saving hours compared to pulling full-grown stalks. Fields were sometimes prepared and left bare for a week, letting weeds sprout so they could be hoed away before crops were sown. After harvest, plows buried seeds too deep to grow, stopping the next season's weeds before they started. Specialized hooks with long handles allowed weeds to be sliced from between grain stalks quickly without bending. Straw, leaves, and even scraps of wool were laid thick as mulch between vegetables. These measures kept weed pressure down with far less labor. Weather adaptation methods. Crops were chosen and planted with weather in mind. Fields never carried just one crop but several, so if one failed, others filled the gap. Cold-loving rye and barley stood against damp years, while beans endured dry spells that ruined grain. Seeds were scattered in multiple locations, some on hillsides, others in low valleys, so at least part of the harvest survived floods or drought. Plantings were staggered across weeks, reducing the risk of frost wiping out every row at once. Drainage ditches pulled water away in wet times, while raised beds kept roots above floods. In dry seasons, water meadows diverted streams to soak fields. Every tool of timing and terrain was used to balance the gamble of weather. Food storage techniques. Root crops were buried in underground clamps, lined with straw and covered with soil, where they kept for months. Grain was lifted onto raised granaries set on stone pillars that rats could not climb. Meat was salted heavily, packed in barrels, or hung in smokehouses where cool smoke dried and preserved it. Fish was treated the same way, lasting through lean winters. Cheese aged in cool cellars provided food when milk was scarce. Cabbage, turnips, and other vegetables were sliced thin, salted, and fermented in barrels for sauerkraut-like stores. These methods required no machines, only knowledge, and they kept food from spoiling long after harvest. Companion grazing. Fields didn't rest empty after harvest. Sheep and goats were often led into them, nibbling weeds and stubble that had been left behind. Their hooves broke crusted soil, pressing seed husks into the ground, while their droppings spread a natural layer of fertilizer. What would have been wasted vegetation turned into forage, and what would have been work with a hoe became effortless cleanup. Goats reached brambles along hedges, clearing ground no tool could manage. Sheep clipped grasses close, leaving the earth ready for the next plowing. Some farmers rotated their animals across strips of land, ensuring each part of the field was fertilized in turn. The system was simple: animals fed, fields restored, and no carting of manure was needed. By letting the creatures work the ground after harvest, old farmers cut labor in half and gave their soil a season's worth of renewal without lifting more than a guiding stick. Wattle fencing. Thin branches cut from hedges or coppiced woods were not discarded. They were woven between upright stakes to form low fences around beds and fields. These wattles kept chickens from scratching up seedlings, blocked rabbits, and slowed the wind that dried young plants. They also held soil on sloping ground, preventing erosion during heavy rains. The weaving required patience but little else, and once made, the fences lasted for years with only small repairs. In some gardens, curved wattles enclosed circular herb beds, each section easy to tend without stepping across. In larger plots, longer panels marked off vegetable strips, giving the garden order and protection without a single nail. The work of cutting and weaving often took place in winter, when fields were quiet, and it gave use to every stick that might otherwise rot in the hedge. These fences, humble and handmade, turned scraps into strength for the garden. Terrace farming. Where land rose steep and uneven, old farmers cut it into steps. Each terrace was leveled with spades, supported by stone or timber walls that held the soil in place. Rain that would have rushed down the slope now lingered in each flatbed, soaking deep into the earth. Fertility no longer washed away, and erosion was slowed to a crawl. Terraces gave access to ground that would have been useless, opening hillsides to wheat, beans, and vines. Crops planted on these ledges were tended with less risk, for the footing was secure and the soil stayed in place. In regions of heavy rains, terraces preserved generations of farmland that might have vanished in floods. Stone mulching. Rocks were not always cleared from fields. Old gardeners often placed stones around plants to act as a living mulch. During the day, the stones absorbed heat from the sun, and at night they released that warmth slowly, protecting young plants from cold snaps. In dry places, dew condensed on the cool stone surface and dripped to the soil below, offering a hidden drink to thirsty roots. Larger stones slowed wind near the ground, shielding tender seedlings from drying breezes. Where soil was thin, the weight of stones also pressed seeds firmly into the earth, giving them better contact for sprouting. Families sometimes ringed their melons or squash with rocks, keeping the fruits dry and less prone to rot. Trench composting. Instead of building piles above ground, many households dug shallow trenches through their gardens and buried kitchen scraps directly. Potato peelings, bean pods, and old stalks were dropped into these furrows, then covered with soil. Over weeks, the waste decomposed right where the next crop would grow. Earthworms worked the soft rotting matter into the ground, leaving behind tunnels and rich castings. Unlike heaps that required turning, this method needed no extra handling once buried. In spring, rows of beans or peas were planted directly above, their roots finding a rich bed waiting. Every trench became a hidden compost bin, refilling the soil with little effort. By season's end, the ground was darker and looser than before, ready for another round of planting without any hauling of manure. Ridge and furrow plowing. Old plows left more than flat ground. They shaped fields into alternating ridges and furrows, a pattern especially useful in regions of heavy rain. Crops were planted along the ridges, where the soil drained quickly and roots stayed dry. The furrows between acted as channels, carrying away excess water and protecting against rot. In drier years, these same troughs held dew and rainfall, keeping some moisture near the plants. Fields managed this way showed raised lines like waves across the land, each a safeguard against extremes of weather. Oxen and men could cover long stretches quickly, repeating the same pattern season after season until it became part of the landscape itself. This system allowed crops to survive in soils that might otherwise drown or parch, making it a lasting mark of careful labor. Ash glazing for pest barriers. When insects crawled across seedlings, some farmers reached for the ashes from their fires. Fine wood ash was sprinkled in rings around tender plants, creating a dry barrier that slugs and crawling beetles avoided. The sharp powder clung to their bodies, drying them out before they could reach the crop. Applied after rain or dew, the gray circles stood like invisible fences, lasting until the next shower washed them away. It was free, abundant, and always near at hand. Unlike heavier mulches, ash broke down quickly, adding small amounts of potassium to the soil as it settled. This trick guarded plants at their most vulnerable stage without extra cost or effort. Urn Storage for Seeds. Clay jars sealed with wax, pitch, or tightly fitting lids once held seeds safe for years. The vessels were tucked into cool cellars or buried under barn floors where temperature stayed steady. Ash, sand, or lime was sometimes layered inside to keep out dampness and insects. When opened, the jars often released seeds as fresh as the day they were packed. Archaeologists have uncovered such urns centuries later with viable grains still inside, proof of their effectiveness. Families relied on these methods to guard against bad harvests, ensuring seed was always ready for the next planting season. Without such storage, one failed crop could have meant disaster. Marigolds for pest management and beneficial insects. When it came to your grandma's garden, there was no brighter ally than the marigold. Its cheerful orange and gold faces were not planted for beauty alone, but for the quiet protection they offered. Seasoned hands tucked marigolds between rows of beans, cabbage, and tomatoes, knowing full well that their sharp scent would confuse and repel harmful insects. Root-feeding nematodes avoided the soil where marigolds grew, and aphids, whiteflies, and beetles were reluctant to linger near their pungent leaves. At the same time, these hardy flowers lured in the helpers, ladybirds, lacewings, and hoverflies, each one a natural enemy to the garden's worst pests. Bees also came freely, drawn to the nectar, ensuring blossoms of squash, cucumbers, and melons were pollinated without fail. Marigolds were more than guardians. They were companions, weaving life into every corner of the patch. Your grandparents scattered their seed along borders, around the edges of potato beds, or even in orchard rows, ensuring that protection and pollination walked hand in hand. Moon phase planting. Your grandparents believed the moon held sway not only over tides, but also over seeds and roots deep in the earth. The waning moon was a signal to sow carrots, beets, and potatoes, for root crops thrived when drawn downward by its pull. The waxing moon, growing brighter each night, was the time for leafy greens and climbing beans, when upward growth was encouraged. Many would not plant until after the new moon showed its face, certain that seeds sown in darkness grew weak. Families kept simple almanacs, recording planting days alongside moon phases, passing these notes down from father to son, mother to daughter. Even skeptics could not deny that harvests often matched the rhythm of the sky. Whether science or superstition, timing by the moon kept the work ordered, spreading tasks across weeks instead of all at once. In cool dawns, a grandmother might whisper, "The moon is right for onions," and out came the seed bag. Raised keyhole gardens. Circular raised beds, often built of stone or timber, featured a small composting basket at the center. Kitchen scraps were tossed into this middle core, and watering was done directly into it. Nutrients and moisture spread outward through the soil in all directions, feeding the surrounding crops evenly. A small cutout path gave easy access to the center, making it look like a keyhole from above. These gardens produced heavily in small spaces and required little bending thanks to their height. Even in poor soil, they thrived because the compost basket supplied steady fertility. Families with small yards or limited land favored them, using every scrap of waste to keep the soil rich without hauling manure from distant fields. Polyculture strip farming. Instead of planting vast stretches of a single crop, old farmers arranged their fields in alternating strips. One row might carry barley, the next beans, then flax, then oats. The variety kept pests confused, since insects searching for one plant often found themselves blocked by another. Diseases spread slower too, unable to cross the barriers of unrelated crops. Each strip also balanced the soil differently. Deep-rooted plants broke through hard layers, while shallow-rooted ones covered the surface. Families rotated the strips each year, weaving a new pattern across the field. Though it looked untidy compared to neat monoculture, it provided steadier harvests with less loss. The eye saw stripes of green and gold, but the soil gained balance and the pantry stayed full. Irrigation canals with overflow ditches. Hand-dug channels carried water from streams or ponds into gardens during dry seasons. Simple gates of wood or stone let families control the flow, directing it across rows as needed. Alongside every canal lay an overflow ditch to catch excess water and guide it away, preventing roots from drowning. This system required nothing but shovels and steady labor, yet it gave gardens reliable moisture when skies stayed dry. In some regions, the canals also spread silt during floods, enriching the soil naturally. Once laid out, these waterways lasted for years with small repairs, saving endless trips with buckets. Families could rest easier knowing crops would not wither after a single hot week. Duck rice method. In wet fields where rice grew, ducks were turned loose as natural workers. They swam among the rows, stirring water with their feet and snapping up insects that would otherwise damage the plants. Slugs, beetles, and larvae disappeared under their quick bills. As they fed, they also dropped manure into the water, fertilizing the crop with each pass. The constant paddling mixed oxygen into the flooded soil, keeping roots from drowning and discouraging rot. Farmers needed fewer hands for weeding since the ducks also clipped tender grasses that sprouted between rice stalks. Nothing in the system was wasted. The rice grew stronger, the ducks grew fat, and the field was left clean at the end of the season. When the grain was harvested, the birds were gathered too, providing both food and labor in one cycle. Trash can composting. Old gardeners didn't fuss with fancy tumblers or barrels bought at the store. They had their own trick for turning scraps into black gold. An old trash can, the kind with rust on its lid and holes knocked into the sides, became their compost maker. They filled it in layers: potato peelings and cabbage leaves, then straw or old newspaper, then more kitchen waste again. Just like building lasagna, only this one fed the soil instead of the family. They never bothered turning it week by week. The heat built up on its own, and in time, the bottom grew rich and dark. They scooped out what was needed, leaving the rest to keep cooking. Coffee grounds, eggshells, and even dust swept from the floor went into that bin. Nothing wasted, everything useful. After a season, gardens no longer begged for bought fertilizer. The trash itself had become the feeder. Height harvest baskets. Tall baskets with sturdy handles were once common in gardens and orchards. Carried on the back or balanced on the hip, they allowed pickers to move easily through beans, peas, or fruit trees without constant bending. The baskets were woven from willow or split oak, light but strong enough to carry a heavy load. The height meant fewer trips to unload, and crops stayed clean and unbruised. Some designs had flat bottoms, so they could be set down between rows without spilling. In busy harvest seasons, these baskets saved both time and strength, letting gardeners gather more food in fewer hours of work. The open field system. Land was rarely fenced. Instead, whole villages shared broad open fields divided into long, narrow strips. Each family tended several scattered strips, mixing good and poor soil, so no household carried all the burden. Work was done together since the timing of plowing and planting had to be the same across adjoining plots. Farmers who owned only one ox pooled teams with neighbors to pull a plow. Harvests were shared in the same spirit, with hands moving from strip to strip until every sheaf was cut. Storage bins often held grain for the whole community, lending food to those who suffered poor yields. The system built resilience against failure, since no one family carried the weight alone. Cooperation in soil and harvest bound entire villages to the same rhythm of work. Fermented foods as self-preserving harvest. Long before refrigeration, folks turned to fermentation as a safeguard against hunger. Barrels of cabbage, shredded and salted, transformed into sharp sauerkraut that carried families through winter. Crooked cucumbers, carrots, and beans were layered in crocks, weighted with stones, and left to bubble quietly in cool pantries. This old method relied on nothing more than salt, vegetables, and time. Natural yeasts and bacteria did the rest, creating lactic acid that preserved food and kept it safe for months. But it wasn't only about storage. Fermented foods gave strength and health, rich with probiotics before such words existed. Miners, farmers, and children alike benefited from stronger digestion and nourishment in times when fresh produce was scarce. Some households brewed kvass or beet tonics, others crafted fermented pickles, each crock carrying a family's particular taste and tradition. Nothing went to waste. Overripe cucumbers, uneven carrots, surplus beans all found a second life through fermentation. Natural pest control with animals. Chickens, ducks, and geese were set loose in gardens before planting and after harvest. Chickens scratched up weed seeds and ate insects by the thousands each day. Ducks sought out slugs and snails, clearing them from damp corners. Geese were used as weeders, nibbling tender grasses while leaving crops mostly alone. These animals needed no training, only the freedom to roam. Alongside them, farmers planted garlic, onions, and leeks to repel insects with their sharp scent. Flowers like marigolds and lavender drew ladybugs, lacewings, and wasps that hunted pests across the beds. The method relied on balance, animals and insects doing the work in place of powders or poisons. Solar dehydrators for preserving food. When summer's bounty threatened to overwhelm the pantry, old gardeners turned to the sun itself for help. With a few boards, some old window panes, and screens stretched taut, they built solar dehydrators, simple contraptions that captured heat and breeze to dry fruits, herbs, and vegetables. Apple slices were laid out in neat rows, beans strung and spread, tomatoes cut and salted, each drying slowly in the warm current of air. Unlike smokehouses or ovens that demanded wood and constant attention, these devices worked freely under the sky, transforming perishables into stores that would last the winter. Herbs retained their aroma, berries shrank into chewy jewels, and every bite held the sweetness of long days. Children often carried baskets of sliced produce to the racks, while mothers checked the trays, turning pieces so no mold could take hold. Which of these methods did you find the most interesting? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoy videos like this, please subscribe and watch the next one. Have a great day.